Revenge does not need a witness. No final scene, no confrontation, no apology demanded from anyone. Just becoming someone the past could not have pictured. Not a slightly improved outline, something the old outline never accounted for. The past is not the enemy here. It is the starting line being left behind. The old standard worked with what it had: limited belief, limited proof, limited evidence that anything could shift. That standard is no longer running things, not because time passed, because a decision got made to become someone that old picture never included. This is not bitterness wearing ambition as a costume. This is direction, clear, specific, aimed at one target only. Not anyone who doubted, not the moments that hurt the most, the space between who stood there then and who is being built now. Close that space, quietly, completely. Not for an audience, just because the old picture deserves to be unrecognizable by the time this is finished. That is the entire revenge, already moving, already working. Arguing with doubt used to feel necessary, defending every choice, explaining every plan, trying to win a debate that was never winnable through words alone. That stopped. Results do not need help making their case. A sentence can be questioned. A result cannot be questioned the same way. It just sits there, undeniable, doing the talking that arguments never could. So the explaining stopped, not out of pride, out of efficiency. Every minute spent convincing someone was a minute not spent building the thing that would convince them without trying. That shift changes the whole posture. No more defending, no more proving through conversation, just continuing, quietly, letting whatever gets built speak for itself. Doubt does not need to be argued out of existence. It needs to be outgrown so completely that arguing becomes unnecessary. That is what is happening here. Less talking, more building. Let the result carry what the words used to try to carry. It carries it better anyway. There is no ceremony where the comeback gets announced. No moment where the past self watches and finally understands. Just a life, lived fully, that once felt completely out of reach. The comeback is the whole life that follows the break, not the moment it started. That earlier self, standing in the wreckage of what felt impossible, could not have believed this was coming. Not because it was impossible, because belief had not caught up to it yet. The comeback is not the single day things turned. It is every ordinary day after, stacked, quiet, adding up to something that earlier self never saw arriving. No audience required. The only witness that matters is the one who almost did not make it here. That witness does not need convincing through speeches. It needs to see the life actually lived, actually built, actually impossible by the old measure. That is the real comeback, not the headline, the ordinary days now, filled with what once felt out of reach. Each one more proof that the story did not end where it looked like it would. Judgment landed early, based on a beginning, a rough one, a struggling one. The mistake was treating that beginning like a conclusion. A beginning never predicts an ending. It only marks where something started. Whoever judged based on that early picture was working with incomplete information, not because of malice, because that is what a beginning looks like from the outside. Unfinished, unproven, easy to underestimate. The error was assuming the unfinished part was the final draft. It was not. Every day since that judgment got made has been quietly rewriting the draft, without asking permission, without needing the original judgment reversed out loud. The correction does not require an apology from whoever judged first. It only requires continuing past the point they stopped paying attention. That is already happening, one disciplined day at a time. The beginning is still part of the story. It just stopped being the whole story a long time ago. What gets built from here decides the rest of it.
Attention was on the failures. Easy to watch, easy to point at, easy to use as proof that nothing would change. Meanwhile, something else was happening, quietly, off to the side, where the watching was not happening at all. Building. The failures were visible. The work happening next to them was not. That gap matters. Whoever was watching only saw what was easy to see: the stumble, the setback, the public part of the struggle. Nobody was watching the part that mattered most: the early mornings, the quiet repetition, the decision to keep going after the failure they saw. That work does not announce itself. It happens in the space attention never reaches. And that is exactly why it works. No interference, no noise, no outside opinion shaping what gets built. The failures gave the watchers something to talk about. The building gave the future something to stand on. Only one of those actually mattered in the end.
Every insult that never got a response sat there, waiting. It assumed silence meant agreement, or weakness, or surrender. It meant none of that. Success is the answer that takes longer but lands harder. Every unanswered insult is owed a reply, not in words, in outcome. That reply takes time to arrive, longer than a comeback line would have taken, but it lands with weight a comeback line never could. A sharp response in the moment fades fast, forgotten within the day. A quiet life built afterward does not fade. It sits there permanently, answering every insult at once, without needing to mention a single one of them by name. That is the trade being made here. Patience now for an answer later that cannot be argued with. Every insult left unanswered in the moment is being answered right now through what is being built instead of what could have been said.
The picture people carry of what came before is outdated. It does not match what exists now. That gap is not an accident. It is the entire point. The picture they remember stopped being accurate a long time ago. Whoever formed an opinion early formed it based on limited information, a rough draft, a difficult chapter. That opinion never got updated because updating it required paying attention, and most people stop paying attention once they think they understand something. So the picture stayed frozen while the actual subject kept moving. That gap between the frozen picture and the moving target grows wider every single day. It does not need to be corrected out loud. It corrects itself through continued growth that the old picture simply cannot account for. One day, the frozen picture and the moving target will be unrecognizable next to each other. That day is getting closer, quietly, with every disciplined hour added to the gap. The spotlight is not where sharpening happens. It is where performance happens. Those are different things. Disappearing from attention was not retreat. It was preparation. Standing in the spotlight requires energy spent on display, on managing how things look, on performing progress instead of making it. Stepping out of that requires nothing performed, just the work itself, unwatched, unjudged in real time, free to fail privately and adjust without an audience keeping score. That is where actual sharpening happens, away from the noise of being observed. Whoever assumed disappearance meant fading misread it completely. It was never fading, it was sharpening, quietly, patiently, preparing for a return that would not need explaining. The blade does not get sharper by being shown to people. It gets sharper through repetition nobody is watching. That is exactly what has been happening, and it is almost ready to be seen again.
Staying small makes some people comfortable, not because they wish harm, because growth nearby forces a question about their own. That question is uncomfortable. So smallness gets encouraged, quietly, sometimes kindly, always limiting. Growing anyway means some comfort around you has to end. That is not cruelty, it is consequence. Every step taken past where someone expected removes a little of the comfort that depended on the old size. Some relationships were built around the smaller version. Growth changes the terms of those relationships, whether anyone agreed to it or not. That is uncomfortable. It is also unavoidable. Choosing to stay small to protect someone else's comfort costs something far bigger than their comfort is worth. Growth was never supposed to wait for permission, not from people who benefit from less. So growth continues, even when it unsettles the room, even when it changes what people expected to manage. The room will adjust, or it will not. Either way, the growing does not stop for it. Energy aimed at people runs out fast. Anger fades. Arguments end. Even the satisfaction of being right does not last long. Energy aimed at limitations does something different. The enemy was never a person. It was the ceiling still standing overhead. The skill not yet built. The fear not yet faced. The discipline not yet formed. Those are the actual obstacles, not the doubters, not the ones who underestimated. Fighting people feels satisfying for a moment. It produces nothing that lasts. Fighting the actual ceiling produces movement, real movement, measurable over time. That fight does not end with someone admitting defeat. It ends with the ceiling no longer being a ceiling at all. This is the fight worth having. Quiet, internal, unglamorous. And it is the only fight that has ever produced anything that lasted past the moment it happened.
Laughter at potential is common. It happens early, before there is proof, before there is anything to point to except a beginning that looked unfinished. That laughter was never really about the potential. It was about what was visible at the time. Potential is invisible until it is proven. That is why it gets laughed at first. Nobody laughs at proven results. They only laugh at the unfinished version of something that has not shown its full shape yet. That laughter says more about limited patience than it does about limited potential. The mistake whoever laughed made, was confusing the beginning with the ceiling. A beginning is just a beginning. It does not predict how far something travels from there. The only response that actually matters is continuing past the laughter until the unfinished thing becomes something undeniable. That undeniable thing is still being built, piece by piece, while the laughter from the beginning fades into something nobody even remembers saying.
Disrespect invites a few common reactions: anger, argument, a need to be heard immediately. None of those reactions outlast the moment they happen in. Undeniable progress outlasts every reaction disrespect tries to provoke. A sharp comeback fades by the next day. Progress does not fade. It compounds. Every disrespectful moment that gets met with silence instead of an argument becomes fuel for something bigger than the moment deserved. That silence is not weakness. It is redirection. Energy that could have been spent defending pride, spent instead on building something that defends itself. Progress does not need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to keep happening, visible eventually, undeniable eventually. The disrespect will be forgotten by almost everyone who witnessed it. The progress will not be forgotten. It will be the only part of the story that holds up over time. That is the response being chosen here, not a counterattack, a result that makes the attack irrelevant. Silence is uncomfortable to hold, especially when there is something worth saying. But surprise held by someone else can carry more weight than any sentence delivered in the moment. Let the surprise do what words never could. Words explain. Surprise reveals. When the moment finally arrives, the one where the difference becomes obvious, no explanation will be needed. The surprise on the faces watching will say everything that could have been argued for years without a single word being spent. That is worth waiting for, worth staying quiet for, worth letting the question sit unanswered until the answer shows up on its own. This requires patience that talking does not require. It is harder. It is also far more effective. Hold the silence a little longer. Let it build. Let whatever comes next be loud enough that nothing needs to be said to make the point. The surprise is coming. It has not arrived yet, but it is closer than it has ever been. A single disciplined day does not look like much. On its own, it barely registers. But nothing built that lasts was built from one day alone. Every disciplined day is a brick in something they said could not stand. That structure does not rise overnight. It rises one brick at a time. Repetitive, unremarkable in the moment, easy to underestimate from the outside. That is exactly why it works. Nobody is paying attention to a single brick. They are only paying attention once the structure is too large to ignore. By then, it is already finished, already standing, already impossible to dismiss the way the early bricks were dismissed. This is happening right now. One brick, today, quiet, unremarkable, necessary. The structure being built does not need anyone's belief to keep rising. It only needs the next brick to actually get placed. Place it. The structure does not care who doubted the foundation. It only cares whether the next layer gets added.
Recognition used to be the target, wanting to be seen, wanting credit, wanting the room to notice the effort being made. That target has changed. Mastery does not need to be seen to be real. Recognition depends on an audience. It requires someone else paying attention at the right moment. That dependency is fragile. It can be withheld. It can be late. It can never arrive at all. Mastery depends on nothing external. It exists whether anyone notices or not. It is built in the unseen hours, and it remains true even in a completely empty room. That shift changes everything about how effort gets spent. No more energy wasted hoping someone notices. All of it redirected toward getting better at the actual thing. The earlier hunger for recognition is gone, replaced by something steadier, a hunger for being genuinely good at something that matters. That hunger does not run out. It does not depend on anyone clapping. It just keeps building, whether the room is full or empty.
Doubt expects a pattern, stagnation, a predictable plateau that confirms the original assessment. Consistent improvement breaks that expectation completely. Nothing unsettles doubt like proof it keeps being wrong. Doubt can handle one good moment. It writes that off as luck. It struggles to explain a second one. By the time there is a pattern of improvement, doubt has no framework left to explain it with. That confusion is not an accident. It is the direct result of refusing to plateau where doubt expected a plateau. Every improvement that keeps happening after doubt assumed the story was already finished forces a reconsideration that doubt was never built to handle gracefully. This does not require confronting doubt directly. It only requires continuing to improve past the point doubt assumed was the ceiling. The confusion that creates is not the goal. It is just the natural result of consistency outlasting low expectations. Keep improving. Let the confusion be someone else's problem to sort out.
The expectation was brokenness, permanent, defined by the worst moment and frozen there. That expectation missed something important. Broken things can become dangerous things. That transition is rarely expected. Whoever expected permanent damage was not accounting for what happens when damage gets used instead of hidden. The hardest stretch did not disappear. It got converted into discipline, into focus, into a kind of sharpness that comfort never could have produced. That conversion is not common. Most expect brokenness to stay brokenness. It rarely gets challenged that directly. But here, it did. The expectation of permanent damage ran into a decision to become something else entirely. Not despite the damage, through it. That is the part rarely accounted for. Damage does not have to stay damage. It can become exactly the material something dangerous gets built from. That building is well underway.
Distance is being measured constantly between who stood here once and who is standing here now. That distance keeps growing. The distance being traveled is the biggest thing built so far. Not a single achievement, not one specific outcome. The actual gap between the starting point and the current position. That gap took every disciplined day to create, every refusal to settle, every limitation faced
instead of avoided. It is not finished growing. It will keep growing as long as the work continues. This is worth more than any single accomplishment could be worth on its own, because accomplishments can be matched. Distance traveled cannot be copied by someone who has not traveled it. That gap is personal, earned specifically through specific days that nobody else lived through the same way. It stands as proof, not of arrival, of motion, continuous, ongoing, still expanding right now.
Disappearance looked like an ending to anyone watching from outside. It was not an ending. One day, the disappearance will be understood as the exact moment everything actually started. Whoever assumed the quiet meant defeat was reading silence the wrong way. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the sound of work happening where nobody could see it. That misunderstanding will correct itself eventually, not through an explanation, through a result that makes the explanation unnecessary. The moment that correction lands will not need defending. It will be obvious. What looked like fading was actually forming. What looked like absence was actually preparation. What looked like the end of a story was the quiet middle of a much bigger one. That realization is still ahead, coming for anyone who assumed the silence meant something had stopped. It had not stopped. It had only gone somewhere quieter to keep building.
The goal was never to make anyone regret a single thing. That target was always too small, too dependent on someone else's reaction, too easy to miss entirely if they never admit it. A bigger target replaced it. The real target is becoming so extraordinary that doubt simply stops applying. Not defeating the doubt, outgrowing the conditions that made the doubt make sense in the first place. Doubt only works where there is room for it, where things are uncertain, where outcomes are still undecided. Extraordinary does not leave that room. It closes it completely, not through argument, through result. That is the actual aim, not regret extracted from anyone, not satisfaction taken from a reaction that may never come. A life built so completely that whatever doubt existed about it no longer has anything to attach to. That life is being built right now. One disciplined day, one limitation faced, one brick placed at a time. The doubt does not need to be answered anymore. It simply stops mattering. That is the only ending worth working toward, and it starts with the very next step taken today.